Okay, today we're going to have a look at rounding numbers. It's a fairly basic function that you have to perform in maths, but a lot of people forget that the basic things are the most important. So if you don't have these techniques or don't understand them, then it throws the maths for the rest of your specification out. So why do we actually need to round numbers up or down? What's the point in doing it? Well, here's a few examples of where you'll use them in maths and life. Firstly, when we're calculating, some very complicated numbers are difficult to multiply, add, or what have you, and sometimes we're allowed to simplify these numbers down by rounding them, say, to the nearest 10 or the nearest 100. A good example in life might be if you're adding up population numbers of different countries, there'd be a ridiculously specific large number, whereas if we can round it to the nearest 1,000, it'll be much easier. Here's an example of a sum that would be very difficult if you tried to do it in your head with the numbers that are written down. But if we rounded them to the nearest 1,000, 12,000 and 38,000, we might find it easier to do that sum then. Some numbers actually go on forever. The classic example of this is pi, where pi is a number we use particularly in working out the surface area and circumference of circles. So you'll eventually use pi a lot. Now the number pi is often referred to as 3.14, but it actually goes on much longer than this. The 3.14 is the number rounded to 2 decimal places. As you can see from the number on the screen, it actually goes on for a lot longer, and in fact nobody's ever found how far it goes on for. So using the actual pi number would be very difficult, in fact impossible. So being able to round it makes it easier to use. And then another reason is sometimes the numbers actually represent units. For instance, you might have calculated tax and worked out that it's 47.2732. That doesn't make sense because the first 2 decimal places with pounds represent the pennies. So we need to be able to round to the 2 decimal place so that we're using pounds before the decimal place and pennies after the decimal place. So what is the first thing you should be looking at? Well, the question always tells you that you're to round it to something, to the nearest 10, to the nearest 1 decimal place, to the nearest 2 decimal places. So for instance, we might be asked to round 3.578 to 1 decimal place. And you have to look at the place before the decimal place you've been asked. So in the case above, we've been asked for the first decimal place to round it to, so we look at the 2nd decimal place. So we're actually working with the number 7. So I look for the decimal place that they've told me to look, in this case the 1st decimal place, and then I look at the place before it, so we're working with the number 7. And then note whether this is 5 or above. And of course, in the case of 7, the 7 is 5 or above. After you've done that, you remove everything after the number you've been told, the place you've been told to go to. In this case, it was 1 decimal place, so the 3.578 becomes 3.5. We can forget about the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and so on. And then we swing back to that note we just made of whether the number was 5 or above. If it was 4 below, we can just forget about it and the job will be done. But of course, 7 isn't. And if the number's 5 above, we have to add 1 to the place we're rounding to. So in other words, 3.5 becomes 3.7. So 3.578 to 1 decimal place. I looked at the 2nd decimal place, and because it was 5 or above, I added 1 to the 1st decimal place and chopped everything else off. So what other things do you have to remember when doing these questions? Well, when you've got your answer, you have to put down, always put 2, however many numbers you're rounding to, dp, meaning decimal places. So it could be to 1 dp, to 2 dp, to 3 dp, depending on how many decimal places you've rounded to. This just tells the reader or the examiner or whoever that the number's actually longer, you've just simplified it down to so many decimal places. Another one that people get caught out on is if the place you're rounding to becomes a 0, and remember that can happen because maybe you had to chop off the rest because it was 4 below, and that leaves it as a 0, or perhaps it was a 9 and the next number was 5 or above, so that when you added on it became a 0. But the important thing is to leave the zeros there. Normally we'd hide them. So for instance, 4.0 to 1 decimal place, we'd leave the 0 there. Normally when we do decimal places, if there's nothing there, we just hide it away and we just have a 4. But when we've rounded, we have to leave the 0 to show that there was something below that. So let's look at a few examples before we finish. First of all, 4.79 rounded to 1 decimal place. Well, first of all, the second decimal place, remember it says the rounded first decimal place, we look at the second. The second decimal place is 9, and that means it's 5 or above. We chop off the rest, 4.7, and because it was 5 or above, we add 1 to the first decimal place. 4.8 to 1 dp. Noting that we put down the 1 dp afterwards. 4.454 rounded to 2 decimal places. Well, we were told to round to 2, so we look at the third decimal place, and in this case it's 4, which isn't 5 or above. We chop off the rest, 4.45, and there's the job done, 4.45 to 2 decimal places. So 495 rounded to the nearest 10. Now this is the same principles apply. It's slightly different to the decimal places, but the same rules apply. So because I'm rounding to the nearest 10, which is the tens column, we look at the units column, the next column down, just the same as we would do with the decimals. So the units column is 5, which is 5 or above. I chop off the rest. Remember now, we have to put zeros instead though. So 495 shouldn't become 49, it should become 490. And then because the 5 is 5 or above, we add 1 on to the tens column. But of course, you have to be careful in this example, because the tens column was 9 to start with, when we added 1 on, 1 moved over and we end up with 500 to the nearest 10. So 4.96 rounded to 1 decimal place. Well, the second decimal place, remember they've told us to 1 decimal place, so we look at the second decimal place. The second decimal place is 6, so it's 5 or above. We chop the rest off and add 1 to the first decimal place. But now remember, adding 1 on, that turns the 9 into a 10, so 1 goes over, and we're left with 5.0. But remember, you don't make that 0 hidden, you keep it there. So it'll be 5.0 to 1 decimal place. And that's it for rounding numbers. Next, hopefully I'll be looking at least and greatest, which will follow on from here.